All right, in today's video, we're going to talk about the 5 pillars of sitting to reduce back and neck pain. Now, this is a super common issue for all sorts of people. Essentially, anytime that we have to sit for a long period of time, if we don't have clear organization in our body, we're going to increase the amount of tension and tone to try and hold us upright. So we're going to talk about 5 pillars. The very first one is to figure out how to establish clear skeletal support. So let's first talk about when we don't have clear skeletal support, what that looks like. So if you take a side view and see me can start to round and tuck my tail under, and from there my chest begins to collapse forward, shorten, and my head and neck roll forward. So this is a very common posture, and it's essentially a collapsing posture, right? So I'm falling into myself, shortening myself, and over time this is going to lead to all sorts of discomfort. It's putting a lot of strain in the low back, and my head and neck are now forward of my spine, so I don't have any support holding the shoulders or the head forward directly underneath. The second thing that people often do is overcompensate by engaging their core and pulling themselves into a good posture. So what this looks like is engaging the low back, really cranking on the extensor muscles, pulling back the shoulders, keeping the head up high. So this is very rigid. And over time, one of two things are going to happen. One, you're going to get tired or distracted, you're going to fall back. Or you're just going to create a lot of excess tension and tone through your musculature, compensating for a lack of clear skeletal support. So, in order to find that clear skeletal support, the first thing that we want to talk about, which is our second pillar, is finding our sit bones. So, I'm going to bring Stan over here for a moment. So, our sit bones are these 2 points right here on the bottom of the pelvis. So this is also known as the ischial tuberosity. It's where your hamstrings attach. Most people, when they sit down, they sit on the back side of their pelvis with their pelvis tucked under. So ideally, we want to find this spot for you to sit on because it's going to create the most clear skeletal support up through your spine and up through the shoulder girdle and up through the head and neck. So, to do that, first thing I want you to do is begin to sit on your hands, bring your palm up, fingertips almost touching, and just rock your pelvis back and forth until you can find those 2 sit bones. So once you've found them, now I'm going to have you begin to round the pelvis forward and then rock it back. So you're just going forward and back. And you're feeling with your hands what part of your sit bones you're rolling over. You can also begin to notice at what point does your spine begin to shorten and your head come closer to the ground, and at what point does the spine begin to lengthen and your head get taller. So we're beginning to explore finding this clear skeletal support so that we can maintain a good posture over time. So figure out at what point do you find the maximum height in your skeleton. And at that point, you should be pretty clearly on top of your sit bones. Now, the other thing that you can do to find your sit bones is that when you sit down, if I sit down like a normal person, I'm going to start by bending my knees and tucking my tail under. And so I've already started with that sit bone rolled underneath, pointing forward. However, if I sit by first driving my hips back, it brings my tailbones pointing backwards. And as I begin to sit down, I can use my hands for counterbalance. And now I'm more on top of my sit bones. One last thing you can do is grab a hold of your glutes, pull the glute tissue back, and shimmy forward a little bit. So now I have maximum support. My sit bones are grounded into the table. I've pulled the glute tissue back a little bit. So that way, again, I have another kind of cushion of support there. And now my pelvis is relatively neutral, which is ideally what we want. We want to think about, you can think about the pelvis as being a bowl, right? So you don't want the bowl tipped back where you're rounded and the water spilling out back. You don't want to be super overly tilted forward where the water's pouring forward. We want that neutral spot. Now, for most people, when they first start figuring this out, they tend to still be behind their sit bones. It's very easy to slowly just fall off the edge. And so even right here, I've lost that contact. Probably can't see it, but I can feel it. So again, sitting down, driving the hips back, you can pull your glutes out, slide forward, and then you have that clear skeletal support on top of your sit bones. The next thing we want to talk about is creating a solid base of support with our feet. So just like any athlete, we're not going to stand like this. We want our feet wide to provide more stability. So when we sit down, we want our knees maybe about shoulder width apart. You can move your feet in and out just a little bit, both of them, to figure out where is that ideal spot where I feel the most stability and support coming up and through my legs into my pelvis. So we want the feet flat, okay? So we don't want to have the feet rolled in or up on your tippy toes. Feet flat, knees about shoulder width apart, and this is all going to create more stability coming up and through our pelvis to help us find that support through our sit bones. So clear skeletal support, finding the sit bones, base of support through the legs. Number 4 is having your hips higher than your knees. So currently, my chair is relatively neutral, so that the pelvis is about knee height. And if I were to be sitting for a long period of time, I'd actually elevate this up a tiny bit so that the center of my hip is clearly higher than the center of my knee. And this is particularly useful for people that have tight hamstrings or tight glutes, because the tissue, the hamstring and the glute, if they're tight, will want to round you under. And so having a little extra height here will reduce that pulling. So hips higher than knees. And the last thing is having a flat seat. So I like sitting on stools. This is nice and flat. The problem is many office chairs tend to have you tipped back so that the back of the seat is lower than the front. And so what that does is, again, it brings the knees higher than the pelvis, which then rounds the low back, and it makes it a lot harder to find the skeletal support and the support through your sit bones. So that's why people with low back problems oftentimes hate being in cars, airplanes, at theaters, because most often those seats tend to be tipped back. So those are your 5 pillars for today. Establishing clear skeletal support, summoning the hips, creating a base of support through the legs, having the hips higher than the knees, and having a flat seat to sit on. So remember, it's our skeleton that acts as the pillar to counteract the forces of gravity that are continuously acting upon us. So hopefully you liked the video. Feel free to leave a comment. Let me know how it goes for you, and we'll see you soon.